trade is often the way to bring countries together, particularly those that maybe don't play so much football. And in terms of should we be concerned about the way that India might treat certain minority groups, well, I'm afraid if we took that attitude towards every country that we traded with, we've got problems. I mean, look across the Middle East, for example, our engagement with Saudi Arabia. I would argue that economic engagement with countries is often the best way to improve relations and to have the opportunity to bring up issues such as the way that minorities are treated. If you don't engage, then you don't have that opportunity in the first place. So I personally think more engagement is good, whether that's through football or trade, and that brings economic but also potentially social and cultural benefits as well.
Do you have a Belt and Road or Pakistan, or not really?
No, not really. I think it's probably your better off on.
So the thing is that Mr. Modi is also a very good diplomat, actually, and he's got a good relationship with President Xi too. They've had a couple of meetings already this year, haven't they? And they had a 2-day summit in China where they didn't have an agenda. It was just an informal discussion to see whether they could find some common ground. What a fantastic idea. There was no joint communique at the end. Brilliant. Because, you know, they're incredibly closely linked. I mean, India is the fastest growing economy in the world. China is soon going to be the largest economy in the world. They've got many similarities. Ideologically, of course, they are different. And there are disputes about ideology, and there are disputes about borders, and there are disputes about security. I think it's very interesting that you raised the question of Pakistan in that, because obviously India's great concern is that the Belt and Road Initiative will be a huge investment by China into Pakistan, which will mean that Chinese military strength and Pakistan's own military strength will be increased and become a security threat to India. And as you say, that idea of the string of pearls, Chinese military bases surrounding India, is something that causes great concern. We touched a little bit on that, didn't we, in the defence session earlier on. But I think it's very encouraging to see all the diplomatic activity that we've seen in Asia so far this year. One other thought about Pakistan is that the Inter-Korean summit and then the Trump-Kim summit that we saw earlier on this year was largely influenced by the diplomatic efforts of China. China has offered to host peace discussions between India and Pakistan. India has rejected that idea, and one can understand that if India perceives China as being very much a one-sided partner in that, well, very much, you know, leaning towards Pakistan in terms of its own strategic interests in the region. But it would be good to see diplomatic progress between India and Pakistan. Certainly that would be a benefit to both countries and indeed to the rest of the world.
So I think I might add my final thoughts before we end this session, that there's a lot to play for. The stakes are higher than ever, and unlike, I disagree with one panelist early on who said that really the UK is the only one who has interest in the bilateral and that it's on the kind of begging end. I don't see it that way at all, actually. I see a very complex game being played. You could call it a great game 2.0. But it's not quite like the old game. It's much more economic as well as geostrategic. And you have kind of Mackinder and Mahan alive and well in the Indo-Pacific in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative and how that's being used in geostrategic terms. I've seen recently a parliamentary submission saying that it wasn't meant to be a geostrategic, it's just a good bunch of projects. But then why is it enshrined in the Constitution of China? Why is it a platform that is received core interest? One of the very few kind of ones that, in other words, it means China's willing to fight over it. So I think this is a very interesting game. But it's also one that the stakes are very high. Investment and trade need always be about security, though, and I'm very pleased that actually, you know, it's very rare to hear someone point out that trade actually is also a way of bringing people together. So on that very high note, I'm pleased. We're going to say thank you to our panelists, but first, I'm very pleased that we have the Shadow Secretary of Trade, Barry Gardner, who's someone who probably knows even more than this panel about trade, and someone who will give some closing remarks to us and perhaps give some indicators of his thoughts on the trade relationship. So I'd like to both say thank you to this panel and welcome to Mr. Garner. So thank you. And Mr. Gardner, please.
John, that was quite disgraceful. Summing up what within an hour or so of the match, saying there's a lot to play for, the stakes are higher than ever. I mean, you know, trying to outdo John Motson on a day like today, I think is really pushing it out. Ladies and gentlemen, I normally find that, you know, about this time of night, I'm sort of speaking between people and their dinner. That's bad enough. But with you, I'm speaking between you, your dinner, and the match. So, look, I'll only be about 3/4 of an hour. Is that? This has been a really strange mix, I have to say. It's interesting, we started off, Gareth was talking about the blocks on cooperation. And he said, basically, I mean, he was keen to ensure that all the things that you thought you were going to hear from people about visas and problems with visas, he wanted to counter first. Well, that's the FCO view of the world. You get your retaliation in first. But boy, did Champa and Sumatra do a number on him by coming back with the statistics. And I thought that was really interesting. But in that first session, Lord Bruce said to us, look, we want to be partners for growth, but trade and security policies are not aligned. And I think there's a real issue here. And I'm actually quite disappointed that we didn't tease that out more today. How much alignment in our trade and security policies do we need to have effective policies in both areas? There was a lot of talk about, you know, who manages to sell what to whom and why, but I don't think we got to the nub of that, and it's something I think that we need to explore, not just what are the what was the phrase that the blocks in cooperation or the glitches in our relationship are in terms of visas and stuff like that, but what are the real glitches in our security cooperation? Because they're there, we all know they're there, but it seems to me unless we actually identify what they are, then we're not going to be able to do the job of work that we need to do to overcome them. I have to say, at the end of the second session, I was crying out for somebody simply to identify sectors, because we'd had a lot about, you know, we talked about the facts of visa policies and immigration and education and so on. I mean, one of the big things that was left out of that, of course, was the fact that we are treating so many Indian students who get defrauded in this country by colleges that go bust, or that the government closes down. We then say to them, you've got 60 days to pay up front new fees to find another college and pay them up front before you become an overstayer. And when they don't manage to do it, instead of treating them as victims of crime, we treat them as the criminals. I really do hope that our new Home Secretary is going to address this problem and work cross-departmentally with the Department for Education to look at what is going on here. Because it's not just that you pay more for your visa or you don't get the same conditions as China now does. It's actually, I have had young people come into my surgeries and explain to me that they have not once but twice done this. Some 3 times have found new colleges, have paid up front, and then lost everything, and tried to explain to the Home Office what's going on. Nobody wants to know. It is the hostile environment. And this is a huge bone of contention. One young woman who came to me actually some time ago now, and it was, in fact, she was the first part of the first delegation that came to me about this. And she said, actually, I said to her, I said, look, you must go and immediately and let your father know, because she was saying that she was so worried about her father. I said, well, you must let your father know. And she just looked at me and she said, I can't possibly tell my father. My father went to every single one of our extended family to raise the money to send me here. And before he handed over that money to me, he made me promise and show him on the website that this was a government-certified college, that I was going to come out with a bona fide degree at the end of it. And she was too afraid to go back because the implications for her family were enormous. And then people wonder, why is it that education's a glitch in the relationship? It's because of that. We are treating people disgracefully in this country, and that resonates throughout the entirety of the relationship. So we talked about the facts, and we talked about perceptions. Facts and perceptions are different, but perception is a fact of which you have to take account also. But as I said, I was desperate for somebody to talk about sectors at that point. And I just scribbled down really more in frustration. Defence, education, IT, tourism, luxury goods, steel, automotive, energy, renewables. There's so much that we need to be talking about in terms of the bilateral relationships that we need to have. And we need to be doing it at a sectoral level, looking at where the commonalities are and looking at how we can work together. I thought the following session was very interesting. The things that I would take out of that, we got on to talking about the Make in India program, and we got on talking about IP and the importance of intellectual property and protection of IP rights. Again, it seems to me it's one of the real glitches at the heart of the relationship that we have not resolved. These are the irritants in the oyster that we need to come to, at a government-to-government level, we need to sit down and say, how are we going to resolve this? What are the ways in which we can have some sort of security for our companies in terms of IP? Sorry, could I get there? But also we talked in this session about robotics, about cyber tech, about space defense, and about the importance of government-to-government sales in those areas. Humphrey was the first person to talk about Russia. And the entire day, I was amazed by that was the first time Russia was mentioned. And then we moved into that session where I really enjoyed that session with Humphrey and Walter. It focused, interestingly, not on the UK and India. Did you notice that? It didn't focus on the UK at all. It focused on China and the US. Fascinating session. Trade routes. Talking about China maritime challenges. Really enjoyed stuff that you were talking about, Walter, in terms of the global. Because we have the most serious challenge to the multilateral rules-based order that we have ever seen, I think, in any of our lifetimes. And it's not simply at the level of TPP, which was mentioned, or indeed of NAFTA. It's not simply at the level of UNCLOS and what's gone on in South China Seas between Japan and China. NAFTA, TPP, Iran, Paris Agreement, the refusal to appoint appellate to the appellate court in the WTO. We're seeing the undermining of the WTO as the very framework for global trade. And that is hugely perhaps the most, well, I thought that was the most frightening thing until I realized that Trump was going to have to appoint another Supreme Court judge the other day, and I thought maybe that caps it. That's pretty frightening, the second Trump judge in the Supreme Court in the US. But in the WTO, basically, you can have up to 10. Normally, you would have 7 appellate court judges, because you need that to process through all the different claims and disputes. We're down to 4, and one of those goes at the end of the year. We cannot function as the WTO with 3 judges. So this is how serious the challenge is to the multilateral rules-based order. And I think the other thing I really wanted to sort of pick up from out of that session is the way in which it's not just about maritime challenges in the South China Seas and in the Pacific. Actually, what you have now, increasingly, is the focus on the Arctic. And one of the most fascinating 4 days I have spent in the past 20 years was spent with the Pentagon looking at their response to climate change, and in particular the focus on the Arctic and the race for the Arctic and the race for those trade routes, those passages through the Arctic seas. This is a new frontier that has been opened up by climate change, by global warming. And so we're seeing there at the very top of our globe a new potential area for conflict, as there is a race for the deposits, the mineral deposits on the Arctic Ocean floor, a race for the energy that might be there in terms of oil deposits. So we're looking at a new area of conflict at the same time as in the middle of our globe, we're seeing global warming dealing with desertification, increasing famine, increasing displacement of people, and the refugee crisis that has precipitating war as a result of the famine, and refugee crisis as a result of the wars. And if you look at the instability in Europe today, believe me, it does not simply come from Brexit. We have such a British-centric view of Europe. We really do seem to believe that on the minds of every European leader is the British question. Actually, what I find is that most of the people in Europe actually are saying, oh, for God's sake, are you still here? You know, you were nothing but trouble when you were in the EU. You know, you wanted your own veto, you wanted your own rebate, you wanted to be outside outside of Schengen. Just, what was it that they said? Stand not upon the order of your going, but go at once. That has been the attitude to us in Europe. Now, look, I hold my hand up. I'm a Remainer, okay? I wish we'd never. I never wanted to embark down this route. But I think if we look at the pressures on Europe at the moment, they are not simply coming from Brexit. And as a result of those pressures, the economic pressures, the pressures of migration that are taking place in Europe at the moment, the European Union that we end up leaving will be a wholly different European Union from the one that we voted to leave. And actually, I think it's a tragedy for Europe. I think it's a tragedy for the world, because we were a very strong voice of rationality and sanity within the European Union, and I think it's at a moment of real crisis for that union. It is an abrogation of what one could see as our global civic responsibility, that we are no longer going to be there participating in those decisions. But that then brings me on to the final session. What do I say about the Institute of Economic Affairs? Well, it was supposed to be talking about UK infrastructure cooperation. With India. There was something interesting where Julian talked about cohesion and turned cohesion. I don't know if you noticed this. It's a very neat elision or a segue. He went from cohesion, which most of us would have thought as a good thing. Cohesion is holding together. It's doing things in an integrated way. And he then went from the word cohesion and cashed it out as two things: dominance by the European Union and a federal superstate. Now, I didn't, my Wi-Fi wasn't working down here, so I couldn't actually look up the word cohesion. But to me, that was a very interesting way of defining it, which I did not agree with. But I did agree with this. He said that ultimately he thought that Brexit was about taking back control. And I think that's right. I think there was a real sense in which people felt, and he articulated very clearly the four areas in which people thought that they were taking back control. Taking back control of their money, taking back control of their laws, taking back control of their of migration, and taking back control of their courts. And I think all of that is broadly right. And I think where I fundamentally differ with him is he said that Brexit was about taking back control, and he failed to pose the following question. Who do you then give control to? Who do you then give control to? Because the interesting thing about the way in which Brexit appears to be going, certainly if you followed the Institute of Economic Affairs view of things, and I don't know if you know this, because did you notice there were no problems with Brexit? Airbus clearly hadn't percolated through to Honda were an irrelevance. But the IEA itself has said it would wipe out most of UK manufacturing. That's what they've said. It would wipe out most of UK manufacturing. That's fine as far as he's concerned, and I'm sorry he's not here, because I hate to speak ill of somebody who's not in the room. I'd far rather speak ill of them to their face. That's fine as far as he's concerned, because It is a balance of interest between the producer and the consumer wins. That's the view. And he was honest. He was honest because he said, look, actually, liberalizing, he talked about unilateral liberalization, unilateral free trade. Okay, we will just take down our tariffs, we'll take down our non-tariff barriers, we'll take down our quotas. Come, bring your goods to Britain, and our consumers will benefit from that. Doesn't matter if it's chlorinated chicken. He said, you know, all this nonsense about eating chlorinated chicken morning, noon, and night. Yeah, but you'll get cheaper goods. The only thing is, if you work in manufacturing industry and you've no longer got a job, you can't buy the cheaper goods. So there is wholesale disruption in the economy as a result of that, and those are people. And he was right. By doing this, you can raise GDP. And that's why he said, so that's where government can get involved about redistribution. You know, that's government's job. Maximize the amount of money that's coming into the country and then fiddle around a bit so that the people who are going to moan about losing their jobs don't feel too bad. I'm sorry, but I want to go back to the first word. I want to go back to cohesion. I want to go back to society, that word that Mrs. Thatcher thought didn't exist. And that's why I completely did not buy what was being offered there. There's no point in going into the detail of the customs union, a customs union. I love the way he said, once that piece of the jigsaw is in place, pointing to the fact that we wanted a free trade agreement and streamlined customs arrangements after the weekend, after the Chequers meeting, once that piece of the jigsaw is in place. Well, it's been a long time trying to find that piece of the jigsaw, and they still haven't found it. I loved what you said about demonetization and about paying tax. Tax is the price we pay for a civilized society. And it's about equality. It's about equality. And government is not just about taxing people to redistribute the growing wealth and the growing GDP that our complete liberalization has engendered. It's about creating a structured society in which people feel they have an equal stake, in which people feel they have an equal right and an equal opportunity, and they are treated with dignity as human beings. And that's why tax and equality go together. There's a lot more I would like to say about today, because I'd have liked to have got on to talking about the sort of trade cooperation that we need. The trade cooperation that we need in terms of the new economy that the world is building. And we didn't talk about that because we didn't focus on the Paris Agreement, the one that Trump has pulled out from, amongst other things. Because the Paris Agreement has set the benchmark. It is a net zero world from 2050 onwards. And probably a good many of us here won't be here to see it, but by God, it's our responsibility to prepare for it. Because if we don't, our children will live with the consequences. And the only way for preparing for a net zero world is by looking at how you go to a low carbon and a zero carbon economy. And that is where the engagement, you know, when Modi in 2015 came to London and stood on the stage at Wembley and talked about the Suryaputra, the sons of the sun, talked about the global alliance that he wanted to build. What is it? You know, $20 trillion by 2030, absolutely poured into renewables globally. That's the sort of vision that we need to be driving forward the trade dynamic and the trade relationship between our country. And it was interesting, you know, you'd have thought that we in the UK, having had Modi announce it here, we'd have been one of the first to sign up to it. Yeah, well, in April when we did, we were the 62nd. And when we did, we brought zip. Somebody talked about the French and why Macron was treated so well. Well, he was one of the early signers, and when he signed up, I can't remember, I've got the figures here somewhere, when he signed up, 700 million euros he contributed. 700 million euros he contributed into that pot. We brought nothing. Now, we had leadership in renewable energy, we had leadership in this area, certainly on policy on climate in 2008. And that can be a huge driver. Remember Modi at the Vibrant Gujarat? The three issues for the next century: globalization, global terrorism, global warming. That's the alignment that we need in terms of our policies. I've enjoyed today. I've been frustrated by parts of today. And I wish that we could have got on to the things where there are real scope to talk sector by sector about how the trade partnership needs to develop. Perhaps that's for another time. Thank you very much.
Barry, thank you very much. I do feel like we've just rather been told off by the headmaster. Having said that, he's absolutely right. You know, it's all very good. I think the responsibility of the knowledge industry, of think tanks, of academia is, yes, the vision thing, but the details matter. And, you know, his remarks brought home to me, and I hope they brought home to you, how important it is for us to get past some of the issues that we need to negotiate and find those sectors specifically that our governments could do more. And you've all been wonderful today. Again, I'd like to thank all the panelists who came and spoke. Again, a very big thank you to the Democracy Forum, to the Foreign Office, to Chatham House, RUSI, and to my lovely interns who've been helping you today, running around with microphones and pouring water. And the good old HJS, what would you do without them? We have drinks outside, which I know will refresh you. So thank you very much, everyone, and a big round of applause for everybody. Thank you.